Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another conversation in North Dakota history. My name is Larry Remley. I'm with the State Historical Society of North Dakota, and our subject today is the Chippewa Fur Trade in the Red River Valley of the North in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Our program is once again funded by a grant to the State Historical Society of North Dakota from the North Dakota Humanities Council and is part of a program series at the North Dakota Heritage Center entitled The Fur Trade in North Dakota. Our guest today is Dr. Gregory S. Camp from the University of Mary. Dr. Camp, how did the Chippewa come to participate in the fur trade of the northern Red River Valley?
Well, like any event in history, it didn't happen in a vacuum. There were a series of events prior to it, indeed maybe as much as 100, 150 years earlier, which allowed the Chippewa to come forth. Of course, the Chippewa had been involved in the fur trade with the French early on in the eastern woodlands where the original Chippewa home was, but also had a number of Indian enemies out there, the Iroquois Confederacy, for instance. There had been a long-standing conflict and basic disagreements over border rights and then alliances with Europeans between the Iroquois Confederacy, which was basically allied with the British and the Algonquin-speaking Indians, of which the Chippewa are a member. And they, of course, were allied with the French. Sometime around 1680, just before King William's War, there was a French attempt to unify a number of tribes in the eastern woodlands area, ranging as far west, in fact, as Illinois and then into Canada. And the Chippewa were one of these Indians that the French tried to get involved in this policy, essentially, of encirclement, trying to contain, a policy of containment, much like you heard of in the 1950s. Basically what it was trying to contain the Chippewa in that New York area, neutralize them as much as possible, because they were the most powerful Indian group at that time. The policy failed, and the Iroquois went on the rampage, essentially, and punished those tribes as well as the French involved in this encirclement policy. And what it did, among other things, was force some of these Chippewas westward. They began making their way further west into the Great Lakes region. And I would say by around 1700 or so, there were Chippewa groups as far west as Lake Superior. So they're beginning to move into areas they might not, or they had not been prior to that time. Their migration there was, in terms of cultural change, was not all that dramatic because it still is basically a woodlands culture there. But once out there, they picked up in the fur trade once again. There were, for instance, a large French and Chippewa trade center on Madeline Island in Lake Superior. And the Chippewa prospered while involved in that. After that, the French continued to be involved throughout the 18th century, or up until the French and Indian War, at the end of the French and Indian War. The Chippewa were highly involved with that. And between 1700 till about 1750, the Chippewa had made definite inroads further west in Minnesota. You had settlements now, instead of being just on the western shore of Lake Superior, you now have them at Rainy Lake, Lake Winnibigoshish, Leech Lake, Red Lake, and so on. And these, in turn, are going to act as jumping off points as they make their way onto the plains. And that really happens in the wake of the American Revolution, when you have a new fur trade company coming into existence, the Northwest Company, to give the Hudson's Bay Company, which had been in Canada since 1680, 1690, I believe, or to give them a good deal of competition. And they made their way out there, or early Chippewa had made their way out there by 1770, 1780 anyway. And by 1790, you have the first, at least semi-permanent Chippewa settlements in these areas.
So they basically came as a result of two forces, pressure from the east and economic betterment. Mm-hmm. What stimulated them actually to make the move from the woodlands to the prairies?
Primarily economics. again, it's the involvement in the fur trade. It's difficult to overemphasize the fact that these people had become dependent on the European fur trade. There's one historian who has gone so far as to suggest that they're no longer even Aboriginal people at this time, because they move when the fur trade moves. Their rise and fall in their standard of living is tied to the whims of the fur market. And as a result, it's difficult to talk about these people in terms of an original lifestyle or traditional lifestyle. That's perhaps pushing the point, but it's well taken. A change had occurred by this time. And in fact, just the idea that the Chippewa are moving onto the plains by the 1780s, 1790s into hostile Sioux territory. Sioux and Chippewa, of course, are going to have a good deal of animosity between the two. In fact, that began as far back as the 1710, 1720, when the French are supplying the Chippewa, the Cree, the Assiniboine with the firearms. They began moving into the Minnesota, that lake area I just described, forcing the Santee Sioux out onto the plains, and then that more or less set the stage for the next conflict that will be encountered, this time directly with the fur trade in the Red River Valley.
So they moved in as a result of their dependence on the furs, on the fur trade. Now, what was the actual beginning of the Chippewa presence in the Red River Valley?
Well, I would say around 1780, at the confluence of the Red and Assiniboine area, what today is Winnipeg, Manitoba, you had Chippewa settlements there, and the French, followed by the British, being involved in getting Chippewas to do some trapping for them. As far as the Red River Valley and what is today North Dakota, or that general area, the Pembina area, we have to look at around 1793 with Peter Grant. Now, granted, you had visits to the plains by people like Alexander Henry Sr., drawing these people forth, but the real, I guess if you could mark a beginning here, a tangible beginning, it would be that post built by Peter Grant across from the mouth of the Pembina River where it meets the Red at what is today St. Vincent, Minnesota, that being 1793, 1794. Financially, the post was a failure. Peter Grant had advocated going into this area because he believed it to be very rich in furs. The Northwest Company was rather dubious about spending money on this sort of thing, primarily because they felt, well, yes, it might be rich in game, it might not, but the Sioux are there, and it's just not going to be possible. Peter Grant went out, and even though it only lasted a year or two, he proved that, yes, indeed, there were furs in abundance in the Red River Valley, and secondly, that the Chippewa, despite the danger, were willing to go forth, at least on a temporary basis, to seek those furs out. And it just set the stage then for the next fur trade post, a little better known, that of Charles Baptiste Charbonnet. Of course, that was in 1797. And he more or less was following up on what Peter Grant had done. He was a bit more successful, actually had some sub-posts as far out as the Hare Hills. Many times the credit is given to Alexander Henry for first getting a sub-post out there. Well, Charbonnet, 1797, 1798, had already done the same thing, and Grant was merely, or rather Alexander Henry Jr., a couple of years later, was just picking up on that.
So Charbonnet's post attracted then Chippewa as workers for the fur trade. What was the role of the Chippewa at this time?
The Chippewa had a couple of roles, primarily trappers, but also as hunters. And they were the ones who were actually going out. There would be white workers going with them on occasion, but primarily they were sending the Indians out to do the trapping, gathering the furs and bringing them back to the post, processing them there, the first part of processing anyway, and then sending them north or west to get them back to market.
Were the Chippewa also the famous voyageurs?
Well, the voyageurs are referring to the whites themselves, although it tended after the 1800s to refer, the term was used also with regard to the Métis, and that of course is something that will occur much more so after the turn of the century.
But Charbonnet's post then did employ Chippewas,
yes,
from northern Minnesota as primarily the backbone of the trade itself, the workers involved, yes, in the fur. What kind of people came from those northern Minnesota settlements to take part in this trade?
Certainly the very brave, I would have to say. Again, it was something that they had to entice the Indians out, because it wasn't like they were just going to an area, going to change jobs, as it were, and get involved in something different and then make some money at it or increase their standard of living. They were taking their lives into their hands, and they knew it. The Sioux were bent on keeping the Chippewa off the plains and were successful for the most part until the turn of the century. The type of people that came, though, would have to be those certainly willing to take the chances. And we're talking primarily about the male heads of family. You're not talking about Chippewa families as such and settlements of any kind in the 1790s. That'll occur during Alexander Henry Jr.'s tenure from 1801 and on. But prior to this time, it's just simply too dangerous. The Chippewa themselves recognize that it's out of the question to bring family, wife and children along at this time. And in fact, in Charbonneau's journal, he refers to the fact that these people want to do this or hoping to it or missing their families and so on, but it just is out of the question. And when they would come across a Sioux war party, they simply took off. They would retreat back then. So at best, I think we could call Charbonneau's post a semi-permanent one. The Sioux knew of its existence, and incidentally was built at the south bank of the Pembina, across the river and a little bit south of Grant's post, which was in what is today Minnesota. The Sioux were aware of this post that was there, but again, there wasn't a terrible amount of pressure at first against Charbonneau, but once the Chippewa began coming in more numbers, the Sioux then reacted.
Okay, then after Charbonneau's post's tenure ended in approximately 1797, 1798.
98, yes.
There was then a 2 or 3 year gap between that and the establishment of Alexander Henry's post in 1800, 1801. Why was that hiatus? Why did that hiatus occur?
Well, again, you had people in Montreal with the Northwest Company nervous about the idea. On the one hand, you had people saying, look, Peter Grant went in there for 2 years, not even 2 trading seasons, and was forced out. Same thing with Charbonneau. He gathered more furs and was successful in bringing more Chippewa out, but the result was the same. It was a financial failure. On the other hand, you had people more willing to take the chances, saying, well, yes, it failed, but we know we can draw the Chippewa out. We drew more the second time around. We can draw more if we go at it in perhaps a little different way. Bring more out, set up, encourage the old Chippewa Cree Assiniboine alliance perhaps to gather once again and protect the interests at Pembina.
In other words, what you're suggesting is that a corporate decision resulted in the movement of a group of people from a traditional homeland into a new land.
Yes, and also there's certainly a business decision on this, on the part of the Northwest Company, but also some of those Chippewas who had gone out as far back as Peter Grant and Charbonneau found that they liked the plains lifestyle. It was different, to be sure. It took some transition. Their entire lifestyle, their culture, once you decide to stay on the plains, is going to have to change. You no longer are a woodlands Indian, and just your way of living is going to change. Some of them found they enjoyed that and look forward to going back.
Okay, so then move on to Alexander Henry in the beginning of the 19th century. What was the grand spur from bringing more Chippewa to the northern Red River Valley and the plains?
Again, the same draw as before, the chance to increase their standard of living. Bear in mind already, there is a dependence on the fur trade. So by the time Alexander Henry comes out, Alexander Henry Jr., not to be confused with Alexander Henry Sr., Alexander Henry Jr. was the nephew of the previous Alexander Henry. He had, when he came out, the Chippewa saw once again a chance to get involved with the fur trade and again increase their standard of living, and that dependence is there. It's sort of, if you want to work, if you want to be able to provide the sort of things that you were becoming accustomed to, the different hunting implements, cooking utensils, and so on, you went back into it again. Again, you weren't terribly enthusiastic, perhaps, except for those that I mentioned that perhaps liked it early on. But nonetheless, you're involved, and you have to partake in this if you want to keep up that standard of living. Alexander Henry's move to the Red River Valley is what I've termed that golden age. Not just a golden age for the Chippewa, but also for the Northwest Company, too. It was the real peak of that trade in that area. Alexander Henry's trade there took off, and there was between 1801, actually Alexander Henry came in 1800, tried to set up a post at Park River, Red River confluence, found that because of the saltiness of the river and other reasons that he wanted to go back to where Charbonneau had been, actually right across the Pembina River now. So you have Alexander Henry establishing a post there in 1801. drawing considerable numbers of Chippewa, 55 immediately, and then it grew to several hundred within a couple years. But during that time period, for whatever reason, the Sioux are just not there. It's the Yanktonais Sioux band. They're making sporadic raids, but nothing like what had happened in the 1790s. As a result, the trade flourishes. The Chippewa feel that they're now safe in this area. Families begin to come out, and you have a time, 1801 to 1805, where the Chippewa were able to establish themselves, put down roots, in fact, become Plains Chippewa now.
So during this golden age, 1801 to 1805, the Chippewa then established themselves as real residents, permanent year-round residents of the valley.
Yes.
What kind of settlements did they develop?
Well, because they were tied to the fur trade, it meant a number of changes in their lifestyle. Now, first of all, they would congregate at Pembina before going out on the fur trade, or going out to the various subposts that Alexander Henry had set up. Perhaps the largest change that they had to undergo was the fact now that they're going to be scattered. Instead of congregating in bands like you would at, say, Leech Lake, Red Lake village, you now are going out in groups of 3, 5, 10, maybe more, to various subposts to partake in that fur trade. And as a result, you're going to be at a disadvantage when a Sioux war party comes along, for instance. And that was a point of considerable concern for the Chippewa. Again, between 1801 and 1805, though, they were able to do that, and the Sioux simply did not react. Why it was a disease? Were the Sioux simply moving west themselves for a time and then came back? We really don't know. The point is, though, that 4 or 5 year period allowed the Chippewa to come out and put down those roots.
And get established.
And get it firmly established. The lifestyle changes themselves, even the mundane things, are rather fascinating that they went through. For instance, the Chippewa, of the woodlands, of course, you associate them with the birch bark canoe. Well, you get out to the prairies, that just isn't going to cut it anymore. If you're going to be successful on the plains, you have to have the horse. For instance, as early as 1797, 1798, Northwest Company geographer David Thompson came to a Red Lake Chippewa village and was asking them about the fur trade on the plains. And the Red Lake chief indicated that, yes, they wanted to go out to the plains and stay there longer, but they didn't have the horse. And it was a real telling comment that chief made to David Thompson. He said, until we have the horse in significant numbers as the Sioux, we're not going to be able to stay on the plains. When we get the horse in numbers that we can at least compete with the Sioux or defend ourselves, we'll be there to stay. And it's something that Alexander Henry Jr. a couple of years later was aware of. He actively encouraged the Chippewa to get the horse. They obtained it primarily through their allies, the Assiniboine Indians, also a Siouxan-speaking group, incidentally, and also trade with the Mandan, the famous Mandan trade that went on before and after Lewis and Clark. That was probably the major change. They obtained the horse, and with it then they began the buffalo hunt also to sustain their way of life. They were becoming in many, many ways Plains Indians. The buffalo hunt, as I said, dependence on the buffalo for the staples of life, changing their religious system to a degree. The old Midewiwin society that had existed in the Chippewa, or the Minnesota forest rather, is altered and eventually in some places like the Turtle Mountains in some ways shed in favor of the Sundance. Again, a very typical Plains, in fact Siouxan ceremony because of the emphasis on the buffalo and so on. James Howard, perhaps the best known ethno-historian of this, makes some claims also that the Chippewa, when they reached the prairie, no longer were this introverted people they had been in the woodlands. When they came out to the plains, suddenly they went through this transformation from, as I said, introverted, perhaps superstitious people to suddenly this self-important, if not, or if self-confident, I should say, if not to some degree arrogant people, convinced of their ability to live on the plains. It rather smacks of the old Webbian notion of environment as they marched across. I saw definite Turnerian, Weberian notions here. But the point is well taken. These people had changed drastically when they came to the plains. They're Plains Chippewa now.
Okay, the Plains Chippewa then become established during this 1801-1805 period. Their culture is in the process of alteration. At the same time, are they not also involved in the establishment of entirely different kinds of communities? Do their communities not change from solely Indian-based to mixed communities?
Yes, that's, besides the culture change the Indian, full-blood Indian peoples underwent themselves, perhaps their most lasting legacy was the creation, or their help in creating this mixed blood society that popped up. It was actually brought with the French and the British, but then put down roots itself, the Métis people. You now have Chippewa, Cree, primarily peoples marrying with the British, the Scotch, English, and French, the French before them, peoples, and creating a mixed blood population, the Métis, meaning mixed bloods. The difference here being, instead of simply a population of mixed blood peoples, you have a group of people that, say by 1810, begin to have certain notions about themselves, that they are not just connected to both white and Indian worlds, but are a culture apart from both, borrowing from both to be sure, but apart from both, something quite distinct. And you have these notions, declarations of a new nation, for instance, are being made at this very early date. Now, whether or not you can actually point to, say, 1814, 1815 period and say, yes, these mixed blood peoples are, in fact, a political and sociological, well, certainly sociological entity, but a political entity, of course, that's been debated for some time, particularly between Canadian and American historians. I think what is accurate is to say the roots are put down at this time. There are people making declarations that they are a new nation apart from both and have certain claims to the entire Red River Valley. And certainly it's the Métis revolts that occur later in the 1800s are going to call back to this time. In fact, some Métis people themselves refer to this as the Golden Age, when they were truly free, were engaged in the buffalo hunting for which they became famous.
The rise of the Métis peoples, however, must have had an impact on the traditional Chippewa or even the acculturating Chippewa presence in the valley.
Most definitely.
Can you describe that change?
Well, at the end of that golden age, again, that 1801, 1805 time period, the Chippewa began having problems, as did Alexander Henry and the Northwest Company. The Sioux returned. The Yanktonais soon returned in strength and began putting pressure on not only the Pembina post itself at the confluence of the Red and Pembina rivers, but on Henry's subposts as far south as the Buffalo River, as far west as the Pembina Hills, and there were even contacts out at Turtle Mountain. And indeed, a Chippewa band, a splinter band, had moved out to Turtle Mountains during these Golden Age years. What happened, though, is the fur trade production began to decline. And with it, the Chippewas, a number of them, perhaps as many as half or more that had come out, returned to the Minnesota forests and began essentially returning to the lifestyle they had before. Other Chippewas stayed on the plains, but perhaps moved up to the Red and Assiniboine confluence with relatives that had been there since 1780. Still others stayed around Pembina, on the Pembina River, or as I said, out in the Pembina Mountains and Turtle Mountains. The Métis, however, that mixed blood population stayed there. They thought of the Red River Valley as being their own, and now instead of spending most of their time just with the fur trade, they began doing the buffalo hunting, again, for which they were famous. And I think it's safe to say that by 1814, this buffalo hunting that was going on typified the Métis lifestyle, or at least began to typify it. It became their stock and trade. By the 1820s, it's just something everyone associates, the 2 yearly buffalo hunts, huge affairs that went on. But the sheer numbers of Métis that the population is exploding at that time is putting pressure on the Chippewa that are there. As I said, a fair number of them already left. And say from 1808 to 1810, the Chippewa peoples will be overshadowed by the Métis, and also by another great change in the valley, the establishment of the Red River Colony in 1811, 1812.
And the Red River Colony was?
Well, the Red River Colony was the brainchild of one Lord Thomas Selkirk. He was Earl of the House of Douglas and a major stockholder in the Hudson's Bay Company. Now, when we talk even about something as, for the European powers at that time, as remote as this area, it's a conflict of mammoth proportions. The Hudson's Bay Company was the older, more established fur trade company, established back in the late 1600s. The Northwest Company was the upstart. It grew up in the wake of the French and Indian War, headquartered out of Montreal, while of course the Hudson's Bay Company was headquartered out of London. With the Northwest Company, they came out here first and were the first to cash in on the fur trade that was going in out here. The Hudson's Bay Company saw this, didn't like it, and established a few posts of its own out here. They were not terribly successful, however. The Hudson's Bay Company was not. Their answer came in the form of establishing an agricultural colony in 1811, 1812, and again, it was the brainchild of Thomas Selkirk. The idea was to put a colony here. The official word was that it was for retiring and retiring fur traders who had been here and from Hudson's Bay Company, as well as Europeans who were willing to make the trip. Their first site was literally on top of the old Charbelay site up at Pembina, on the south bank of the Pembina River, where it meets the Red River there at the confluence. After the boundary was drawn in 1818 through the treaty between Britain and the United States, of course, they realized they're on the American side of the border, so they moved north. But settlements went from Pembina all the way north, scattered here and there. Now, that was put there to put pressure on the Northwest Company. It was, again, a fur trade notion. The Northwest Company put pressure back on the Hudson's Bay Colony there by getting the Métis to believe that the Hudson's Bay Company colony intended to control their movements, as indeed they did. The most famous incident, or incidents, first involving in 1814, the proclamation, which specifically forbade the Métis to run buffalo or to hunt buffalo in an unlimited way. Of course, that resulted in what became known as the Pemmican War, which lasted from 1814 with the beginning of this proclamation, really till the fur companies merged in 1821. And it's during this time, as the Métis are really fighting for their way of life, with the encouragement, of course, of the Northwest Company, that these roots are put down. And as a part of this, the Chippewa are sitting back and watching this happening with some horror, I might add, because the fur trade is gone now. It's now an agricultural, permanent white settlement in the area, to which they have difficulty relating. Their Métis relatives are more interested in the buffalo hunt. Their Métis or their mixed blood relatives don't consider themselves Indians. They don't consider themselves white. They consider themselves in charge of the valley. So the Chippewa are forced to take increasingly a backseat to these two groups as they vie for power. In 1821, the Northwest Company and Hudson's Bay Company merge, so that fur trade war that had gone on ends. The colony's survival is thus ensured. It's a question now of what you do with the Métis. They're still there. They still cling to that notion that the valley belongs to them. And there would be conflict between between the Hudson's Bay Company and the Métis people for decades to come, until finally in 1869, when you have the first Métis revolt. But the real roots are back at this time, because that notion that this is our land, regardless of this boundary that the whites might draw, this is our land, the Red River Valley, on both sides of the border. And the Métis, increasingly as time went by, sought to get the British and then Canadian and then the Americans to recognize this claim, to draw boundaries, have a recognized homeland, if you will. And both governments continually sought to place the Chippewa or the Métis with their full-blood relatives, as the United States had done with other tribes. Well, you're mixed blood, you belong with whomever your Indian relatives were. The Métis didn't see it that way. They're distinct in their own view, and the United States to this day doesn't see it that way. They still see them as being essentially belonging to whatever full-blood tribe from which they sprang.
But there are remaining Chippewa in the valley after the fur trade declined.
Yes.
During the second decade of the 19th century. What occupies them?
The life for the Chippewa now, say from the time of the Red River Colony, say 1811, 1812, is pretty threadbare. The diary accounts and official reports that are available to us describe a Chippewa population that is quite destitute now. The fur trade, again, just isn't there. They thus have to come up with a lifestyle, some way of living that they can support themselves. They turn to buffalo hunting more and more, but what they have problems with is that the Métis have so many more people and are taking so many more buffalo that they're finding trouble just in occupying themselves or getting enough to eat. Now, I should point out, this is with the Chippewa of the Pembina River, Pembina Mountains. The Chippewa in the Turtle Mountains did not have that problem, at least not at this time. They were that splinter band that in that 1801, 1805 golden age moved out, and in the isolation of that area were able to live on the berries, the nuts that are there in plenty, or that were there in plenty, the fish and the fowl that were there in great numbers. And in the wintertime, the bison, of course, would go into the woods for protection. It was something of an oasis. So they did not suffer that same level of decline as did their Pembina Chippewa. Now you can start to talk about a Turtle Mountain band of Chippewa by this time too, and a Pembina band. Related, to be sure, by blood and marriage, but just the fact that this band had split off as early as that far back, they consider themselves different also.
So how much interchange was there then between what you're describing is basically a self-sufficient band of Chippewa in the Turtle Mountains and an increasingly more dependent band of Pembina Chippewa?
Pembina Chippewa, on occasion, and with increasing frequency, as best we can tell, 1820s and 30s, were making trips to Turtle Mountain because they had relatives there, of course, and because food was the supplies of food there were greater. The Chippewa themselves, because of the isolation, there was something of a buffer zone between all of this. By 1830, however, this isolation that the Chippewa in the Turtle Mountains had enjoyed is going to be gone. The Métis are beginning to range far out onto the plains. They're massing, in fact, at the Turtle Mountains on the eastern side of the Turtle Mountains. In fact, if you go to the Turtle Mountains today, climb Butte St. Paul, it's a state site, of course, you can see in several directions 70, 80 miles. And you can see from that point, and it was one of the lookouts the Chippewas used at that time, you could see the Métis massing on the eastern fringe of the mountains. And you could see and look with despair because you knew this group of sometimes as many as 200 carts go out onto the plains, hunt the buffalo, slaughter them by the hundreds and thousands, and in effect threaten your food supplies. So by 1830, the Turtle Mountain Chippewas are not going to have that, I guess, that isolation that had protected them up until that time.
Is there not a regular trail established between Turtle Mountain and Pembina?
Yes. The Métis had established trails, well, all over the Red River Valley. Some of them to this day are marked, and some of them you can even see ruts to this day. Well, for instance, where the Red River Valley, where the depression begins from the glacier, the Métis generally had the cart trails along the sides of those, and you can still see those. Every time I go by that, whether it's on an interstate or a state road, I see if I can find those myself. But they were well-established trails. They were something the fur trade was familiar with, and certainly the Métis were using them over and over again. And the Chippewa, of course, were familiar with it. I'll try not to give the impression, however, that the Chippewa and the Métis were totally separate from each other. There was interaction between these two groups. And to be sure, the Chippewa themselves, on occasion, would go on hunting excursions with the Métis. There wasn't, I guess, bad blood between the two. That didn't happen until the 1840s and 50s, when the Métis are killing more buffalo than perhaps was needed.
Mm-hmm. Well, I am curious about the establishment of this Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa as well. It would seem that there was a transition from northern Minnesota woodlands to Red River prairies and then back to woodlands ways. Is that a correct impression?
In part. Certainly the Turtle Mountains were attractive to the Chippewa people. In fact, the logical sequence would be that they came out to the Red River Valley, began doing trade or looked trapping for the Northwest Company, go to the Pembina Mountains. Again, an area not much unlike the Turtle Mountains, very wooded, very lush. And then going out to the Turtle Mountains and finding a much larger area, very similar to their northern woodlands home. The Chippewa then would return, tell others about it, and eventually a splinter band moved out, headed by the first of the Little Shell chiefs. There's a hereditary Little Shell at that time, one in the middle part of the 1800s, and then one in more historical times with treaty negotiations between the United States and the Chippewa band. But they moved out, as I said, between 1801 and 1805, but did not go back to a woodlands culture. Again, it's an island. It's like an island in a vast prairie sea, you might say. They're living there, that's where their home is, so there are some woodlands culture things that are retained there, but again, most of their food is in bison hunting, so they're going out on the plains to hunt. So they retain and incorporate a good many plains lifestyle and traits, just as their Pembina Chippewa brethren had to the east.
So the Turtle Mountain Chippewa, or the Bungee, which is a name I believe is given them by anthropologists primarily, became a cross section of cultures. Then is that part of the tradition that continues?
Yes, the Turtle Mountain people are, to this day, for the most part, a plains group, but there are still ties to the woodlands culture. I would have to say, with the Turtle Mountain people, by the late 1800s, and well, even true today, the real tie is with the Métis people, because there are Michif, as they're called up there. The tie is with those two bands that have gotten together. After this rise and fall of Métis nationalism, the Métis or Michif at Turtle Mountain combined once again. And for a good part of this century, there just wasn't that much of a recognition of a Métis people. It was simply Turtle Mountain Chippewa, mixed bloods, etc. And that's changing, of course, in contemporary times.
Okay, now we've established a Turtle Mountain band of Chippewa, based primarily in a relationship to a Pembina band of Chippewa. Is there still a Pembina band of Chippewa?
Yes. In fact, I saw population figures not too long ago showing that in the Pembina County area, the Rowlett County and Cavalier County, perhaps 400 to 500 Pembina Chippewa still living, still on the rolls. And as far as that goes, there are Pembina Chippewa. Well, technically, the Turtle Mountain Band are Pembina Chippewa, because after all, that's where they came, migrated to. And then also in Montana. And then in North Dakota, at the Trenton area, Williston area, there's a substantial number of Chippewa there.
Okay. Well, I want to follow up on a couple of ideas that occurred to me while you were chatting earlier. The diffusion of fur trade posts that the Chippewa operated during, or were the workers at during the early 19th century. Can you describe that network to us?
Yeah, that's, I find, is one of the most attractive aspects of the Red River Fur Trade during Alexander Henry Jr.'s tenure there. He perhaps got the notion from Charbonnet earlier, but the idea was not just to have one central post, like as Peter Grant had done, and again, it didn't prove terribly successful, because when you trap out that area immediately around it, well, that's it. Alexander Henry, after he transferred his post from the Park River to the Pembina River confluence, went about setting up a series of subposts. The most famous one being in the Pembina Hills, but also at the old Park River site, a subpost, but the Buffalo River, Pelican River, Forest River, the Rat River in Manitoba, and all up and down the Red River Valley in what is today Canada, as far south as the Buffalo River, which would be just north of Fargo, maybe 10, 20 miles, something like that. In fact, the Hudson's Bay Post was built there later at Georgetown. But that's considerably south of that original post at Pembina. What Henry would do would be something like what I heard referred to once as crop rotation. He would have these subposts in various areas. None of them would be open all at the same time. A considerable number of them would, however. What would happen is one area began to show signs of decline in fur trade production or pelts. He would shut it down before it became extinct, move on to another subpost, open it up, and begin trapping there, and thus rotate the subposts when they would be open. By doing that, he could ensure, or felt he could ensure indefinitely, that fur trade would be lucrative. He would continually be bringing these pelts back to Pembina and then shipping them back. And between 1801 and 1805, it proved remarkably successful, again in part because the Sioux were not there. It began to fail after 1805 for two basic reasons. The Sioux came back, as I indicated, and began hitting these posts and causing problems. But secondly, because Henry's Chippewa, Cree, and Assiniboine trading partners began overtrapping themselves. They were not following the plan that Alexander had. They, again, were trying to get as many pelts to get as much as they could, and as also part of that began killing more game. Game depletion became a problem then. So it's going to be the double whammy, you might say. The Sioux attacks, and then the Indians themselves, trading partners of Alexander Henry, overtrapping.
How long did these subposts operate generally? Was it on just simply a year-by-year basis? Or?
Well, again, it depended on the production. If it looked like you could continually trap there without overtrapping, there's no reason to close it. If it looked like it was beginning to decline, and they had to take into account whether or not it was a bad winter, if there was some other reason why the animals were dying. And in fact, I believe it was at the Salt River Post in 1802 or 1803, where Alexander Henry comments in his journal that the animals were dying. The beaver were dying of some disease, so they closed that immediately. It wasn't a result of trapping. It's just that they found beaver laying all over dead and dying. So there was some natural catastrophes there, too, that would force the closing of a post.
Okay, you mentioned briefly a few minutes ago the locations for these posts. Is there any extant current record that shows possible locations for these posts for anyone who might be interested in seeing a map of such things?
There have been a number of secondary sources, historians in this state as well as in Minnesota, that have published, for instance, in North Dakota History or the North Dakota Collections, the early portion of North Dakota History, and Minnesota History, that have done articles saying where some of these posts were at. Of course, they go to the original source, Alexander Henry Jr.'s record, which is still in print, and you still can borrow that. It's usually at university libraries or specialized libraries, such as at the Heritage Center. It's available there. There he'll describe where these things are at, where these posts were. There's still some, because of course geography and the land has changed considerably since that time, nearly 200 years ago now. There is some disagreement in some of these subposts where these things were. As far as actually a structure standing anymore for the Alexander Henry era, no, there isn't. But you can go to these areas to this day. I've tried to visit as many of them as I can just to get an idea of what it was like and try to imagine somehow what it was like. The Pembina area itself, for instance, I find rather fascinating. You can literally throw a rock in two different directions, and if those posts were still standing, hit any one of them. It was an area of a great deal of energy and activity during this, from say 1797 to, well, as late as even 1821. And there was a lot going on there, and it's fun for me as a native North Dakotan to go up to these places and see where the first white settlement, anyway, was really going on, and the tremendous impact that the Indians had in helping to establish it.
Well, speaking of that, can you describe, we had many subposts apparently, as many perhaps as a dozen subposts along the Red River Valley, staffed, as you've said, by Chippewa workers under the direction probably of an Anglo or a Euro-American factor or part of that post hierarchy. Approximately how many Indians would staff a subpost?
Well, again, early on, there simply wasn't that many. In 1800, 1801, when Alexander Henry came, he had a handful of Chippewa was all, and he had a plan, as it were. 1801, 1802, when this plan started to take off and he saw that the Sioux were not going to be that much of a factor during these early years, more and more Chippewa are coming out. Most of the time, it would be a band as small as 2 or 3, usually 3, but could have a dozen, 2 dozen men. Again, depending on what they were after, what the harvest was going to be like, and if there was danger from the Sioux. They were going to take some precautions, of course, to make sure that if a Sioux war party of some size came along, that they'd at least be able to defend themselves. In Henry's record, there's several instances where he talks about the Sioux coming upon a subpost. Most of the time, the Chippewa would simply hide, because if there's 3, 4 of you there, and there's maybe 20 in a Sioux war party, well, you're not going to do much about it. You're going to hide. On other occasions, for instance, the Buffalo River site, and that was his first indication that the Sioux were back in 1805, 1806. He had a sizable contingent of Chippewa down there, and he reports, as does another source, Tanner, James Tanner's Indian Captivity narrative, that suddenly the Sioux swept down upon them and caused a great deal of havoc there. So it was a dangerous operation, especially dangerous if there's only very few of you there. A little bit safer if there were more numbers. And after 1805, 1806, it seemed no matter what your number, it was going to be dangerous, simply because the Sioux were back and making a concerted effort from the south and then slowly pushing them north, trying to keep them penned into the Pembina area. And of course, Pembina itself was hit in 1808, and that finally convinced Alexander Henry, after a couple of years of fur trade decline, the overall harvest was declining. He finally decided, well, this is it. It's not going to work anymore. And shortly thereafter, there were Northwest Company traders still in the area, but Henry himself moved on.
Well, your description of the subpost system raises several questions, one of them physical. What was a subpost? Was it a real fort, like we have the image of from movies and popular literature?
Well, most of the time it was a little more than a shack, a subpost, especially in the more extreme ones. Henry and earlier historians have used the word fort, and again you have the notion of this palisaded thing with blockhouses. Well, no, it was very small. In some cases, there were a wall around it simply for protection of the larger posts. But the sub-posts tended to be small buildings, one-room affairs where they simply would have a shelter, and they would use that as a headquarter or a center as they would fan out, say, along the Buffalo River, trap, get the beaver, bring them back, or whatever furs they were happened to be collecting at the time, bring them back to the sub-post, and then eventually pack them up and send them north to Pembina, where they in turn would be packed again and sent to market.
Okay. Can you describe the annual round for the Indian workers that were the basis of this whole system?
Well, the fur trade generally began in the autumn. For instance, Henry came back in the autumn. And the reason being, quite logically enough, is you want to start trapping them when they have their thicker fur, as their fur is getting thicker. And early spring was quite popular for them to begin taking these. Although with other animals, as time went on and the fur market demand for it was such, they would begin trapping other animals, and at different times because of the color of the fur would change, of course, with some of these animals that they were trapping. And also because they perhaps didn't want a pelt quite so thick. So at first it tended to be over the winter months, and then especially the early spring, followed by a time of inactivity. During the time of Peter Grant and Charbonnet especially, when it was over, when the fur trading season was over, they went back to the forests. With Alexander Henry, this is the first, and that's why we call it the first permanent post, because Henry himself disappears, goes back to Montreal or points east, and when he came back, he found that the Indians had stayed there. And again, it proved to the Indians that they could stay there over an entire year season, and it proved to him these people were really serious about staying. And he knew then, if he didn't know it before then, that they were indeed going to be the backbone of his fur trade operation.
The workers.
Yes.
The worker, the working class, to use the Marxist term. So the furs were trapped in the winter, fall, winter, and spring, prepared as they are trapped, I assume, for shipment. And then shipment occurs in what manner?
Well, primarily on canoe. You'd send it upstream or downstream on the red. I continually get that turned around as you have a north running stream. But would send it north, and from there, perhaps at the Assiniboine Red River area, would then transport them west, or simply take them west, overland, or through the lake system anyway, Rainy Lake, and then onto the Fort Williamson, for instance, later was established on Lake Superior, and then they would simply make the rounds, or route eastward back to Montreal. A lot of these ended up going back to Europe.
And what would happen to them in Europe?
Of course, it was always popular for hats. Ever since the time that the fur trade began in France, it was very popular. But the fur trade underwent a revival of interest in France, interestingly enough, through people like Benjamin Franklin. During the time of the American Revolution, he was the ambassador to France, and he took particular delight in wearing these frontier fur hats. And it caused something of a fad among the upper classes in France, caused more demand for some of these furs, and as a result, not just of Benjamin Franklin, of course, but in general, it caused something of a demand.
Well, I'm going to propose a scenario, and I'd like you to comment on it, if you would. The origins of the furs themselves are in the central part of North America, trapped by Indian or native workers under the direction of Euro-American individuals who are primarily native to North America. They are sent to a collection point, probably at the confluence of the Assiniboine and Red Rivers. They are turned over to Métis or French-Canadian voyageurs who transport them back to Montreal. In Montreal, the furs are turned over to primarily French-Canadian, in other words, white workers, and then placed on whatever transport system is available and shipped to France or to Europe, wherein they are processed into finished products by Europeans. So basically we have a whole transfer system where the basis of which is the Native American. What kind of remuneration did the basis of that system receive?
Well, as sadly has been the case in white and Native American work systems, the lower you are on the totem pole, the less of the pie you get. The Chippewa, for the most part, were getting the European wares that allowed them to make the transition onto the plains. Particularly, they're interested in getting the horse, which they tended to get from the Indian sources, but guns, knives, axes, metal objects that would allow them to maintain themselves on the plains, give them an advantage over nature as much as possible, and then give them an advantage over their enemies. But as far as any kind of profit-sharing plan for the Native American, no. Again, the lower they were on the economic spectrum here as far as the fur trade goes, there just wasn't that much given to them in terms of what Europeans would consider remuneration. Certainly, currency as such just wasn't that important. With the Métis now, it's going to be different. Métis have begin using a moneyed economy because they took what they considered the best of the European culture and the Native American. From the Native American ability to live and survive in a sometimes harsh environment, from the European, an emphasis on education, Roman Catholicism, a moneyed system, etc. So in many ways that the Métis, especially if you were to see one, the way they dressed walking around, say, 1820, 1821, wouldn't be too much different than an average colonist.
So indeed, then the system becomes one established on a basis of barter at the source and then transposed into a moneyed system at the final resting place or the final sale, a retail outlet for
Sure, it's definitely a profit motive, paying them or giving them as little as you can, essentially. And in time, Indians themselves began complaining about, for instance, the beaver pelt was worth a knife or an axe a year ago, but now it takes 2 or 3 beaver pelts to get that. Why is this? And they had difficulty explaining. Well, the market now, is such that it just doesn't. And again, they're trapped. They're a victim of a system that they can't control. They're a dependent laborer, and whatever the whim of the market, they have to suffer. If times are good, well, they can get more for their furs. When times are bad, that's just the way it is.
What role did liquor play in the Chippewa fur trade?
Unfortunately, it did have a role. It's something that's the Spanish, English, and French all said was terrible that liquor trade was going on with the Indians, yet all of them practiced it. With the Northwest Company, they went in and tried, at least early on, to trade simply with utensils and that sort of thing. But the Indians, because they had contact with some of the French, and the French were using liquor, demanded liquor trade also. In fact, Charbellet, that was finally one of the things he resorted to. He began offering not only the utensils they wanted, but liquor. And that was one of the draws for the Indians to come out.
Was the liquor manufactured at the fort sites?
No, I don't believe so. And it was cut many times, too. And a lot of times we tend to think of just bringing a bottle of straight rum. Well, a lot of these Indians had never drunk or imbibed of liquor before, so what they'd end up doing is cutting the liquor with water and making it go as far as you can. And if you drink enough of it, you're still going to get drunk eventually, or feel the effects of it. But as they went on, and the Indians caught on, and for instance, they were able to get from someone else stronger liquor. For instance, they'd say, "Well, hey, this isn't what we want. We want something better." So they learned the ropes too, of course.
Right. Let me conclude this little part of the interview by asking if liquor was as substantial a part of the Chippewa fur trade as many of us have come to believe by reading the popular record.
You mean of Indians in general?
Yes.
I don't think so. To say that it didn't play a role would be inaccurate, but I don't think it was as important. I think what happened to the Chippewa people, it was something that was used to entice them out onto the plains, but once they got here and made the change, there was enough of a psychological and physical change in the Chippewa that for many of them this was now home, and it wasn't something they needed to keep them there. To be sure, they continued to use liquor after they got here, but it wasn't something that kept them here. It wasn't like if Alexander Henry or whomever didn't use liquor that these people were going to take off on them. It was something that was offered and something the Indians wanted, but I don't think it was something that would necessarily keep them here.
So it was one part of the trade.
A part of, but I would not call it a major part of it.
And probably secondary in importance to horses and metal goods and especially firearms.
Yes, especially firearms.
Okay. Are there extant remnants of that trade in those other hard items that are available for people to view today?
Well, at the Heritage Center here, of course, there are a number of artifacts that a person can look at, ranging from Métis artifacts to just general Plains Indians artifacts, particularly then with Chippewa. And that's certainly worth seeing. But also up at in Cavalier, North Dakota, they have the Pembina County Historical Society has a small museum that, of course, is going to specialize in artifacts and items from that part of North Dakota, and with regard to the Indian and Métis, and that is certainly worth seeing as well. Again, I would encourage people to go to places like that, and then at Pembina and the other state historical sites, the Jinra site, for instance, at Walhalla, the Kitson site, etc. And that's probably the best place you can go to see some of these things, at least as close as it perhaps actually was, at least what we have left today.
Okay, and then two other questions for you, Greg. First of all, what is the major source of information about the Chippewa participation in the fur trade and their arrival on the northern Red River Valley prairies?
The best sources we have, as one would expect, are going to be white sources. Indians simply were not keeping written records. They have oral traditions that we go to and refer to. William Warren, for instance, the Chippewa chieftain in Minnesota, put down on paper a good many of these origins and oral traditions. But for what we use today, we have to depend on the fur trade journals for the most part. Charles Baptiste Charbolet's journal, for instance, is still with us. That's up at the archives in Winnipeg. Alexander Henry Jr.'s journals, as I mentioned, are still available and can be seen at most university or specialized libraries. Alexander Henry Sr.'s records are still there. His book travels into the interior of North America. Then there's a host of other fur traders that kept records. And it's really fortunate in that these things were kept. Sometimes they're rather mundane things, but they give excellent day-to-day accounts and their observation of what Indian life was like. And then, of course, the ethno-historians, excuse me, their studies that have been done in the 1950s. Harold Hickerson, his work was nothing short of superb on the Pembina Chippewa and what happened there. John Ewers, of course, with the Turtle Mountain, the dock at 191, it was eventually put out by the Greenwood Press on the Little Shell band of Chippewa Indians, and it talks about some of the changes they went through. But there are a host of records available, and fortunately, excuse me, a lot of these are available and can be seen outside of an archives. You can go, these things are in secondary source material, and they are available. I would encourage anyone who's interested to look at places like the Heritage Center at the archives and library there. Ask the staff there. They're certainly familiar with these records, and they'd be glad to bring them out and allow someone to see them.
Okay, and then in general, in conclusion, I'll give you a chance to make a sweeping statement here. What was the significance and impact of the Chippewa movement to the northern Red River Valley to participate in the fur trade? This is your one chance to dissertate at length.
I guess the major significance is the transition of a culture from a woodlands to a plains culture. To be sure, the Sioux had done the same thing earlier, the Cheyenne, but the Chippewa are different in a couple ways. One, that they were able to come up against a very fierce Sioux foe and survive, and he was tied to the fur trade. The Sioux coming out onto the plains was nomadical. It was not drawn because of the fur trade. And secondly, that it produced a mixed blood population, the Métis. And the Métis, of course, are going to have a tremendous impact, as will the Chippewa themselves, but the Métis in particular are going to have a tremendous impact on the history, not only of North Dakota, but of Manitoba and Canadian history.
So essentially, the ultimate significance and impact of the Chippewa migration to the Red River Valley to participate in the fur trade was the establishment of a changed culture and the establishment of a new peoples.
Mm-hmm. A changed culture with regard to being tied to a European fur trade, and a new people, yes, the Métis.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've been chatting this afternoon with Dr. Gregory Camp from the University of Mary. Our subject has been the Chippewa fur trade in the Red River Valley of the North, 1790 to 1830. This has been another in our Conversations in North Dakota History, funded by grants from the North Dakota Humanities Council and sponsored by the State Historical Society of North Dakota. Thank you for being with us. My name is Larry Remley.